So, Mimi Kwa, wonderful to meet you. You're in Australia, and
Yes, I'm down under in Melbourne, Australia.
which is a very beautiful place. I'm a little bit jealous as the rain is pouring down here in the UK. And you're a presenter and a broadcaster, an author of your first book, House of Kwa, and the mother of four. Do you
Yes.
want to add anything else to describe you?
Oh, I'm actually an avid meditator. So I do a lot of meditation, and it's something that I'm profoundly interested in at this stage in my life. And I'm actually studying a course at University of California, Berkeley College, to become a mindfulness meditation teacher.
Wow. Well, let's get into that. That's really interesting. So, I have a first question for you, which is there a particular challenge you are facing or have faced? Or what is the particular challenge? I think we all have challenges. I'm not sure it is, but what is?
Yeah, so I have challenges every day, just in day to day life, as I think we all encounter. But in terms of perhaps an epic and out of the ordinary challenge that we could talk about was when my father sued me in the Supreme Court here in Australia. So that was pretty challenging. And what that did for me in terms of my mental health and well-being is it sent my hair grey overnight. So I literally went to bed with raven black hair, and I woke up with a sprig of substantial grey hair on the crown of my head when I woke up in the morning. And I think that just really speaks to all of those stress hormones that must have just been coursing through my
Yeah.
body after I opened the letter from my father saying that he was suing me in court. And so that was a big challenge.
I mean, I could feel my body kind of react, even though I kind of knew it in the sense that, none of us live in ideal or perfect families and we have conflicts, but it takes it to a level that feels like a proper visceral attack when your own father takes you to the Supreme Court. I mean, that feels like almost like war. And I can imagine, because as children, whatever our parents have been like, we kind of see them. They are our primary kind of regulators and how we feel safe. So if the person you most relied on to feel safe in the world turns and actually attacks you, I'm not surprised you went grey overnight. The kind of cascade of fear and kind of terror of my safe person has attacked me must have been kind of unbearable.
Yeah, I think what it was for me, it was as it would be for any child with somebody who decides to sue them, it just felt like the deepest form of abandonment that
Mm.
even as a 40 something year old woman who had spent her entire life trying to create normality around me, trying to build a life for myself that was in contrast to the dysfunction that I'd grown up in. I think probably because I'd been trying to hold it together for so many decades and had just been very focused on career, building my own nuclear family, helping my mum, who's a chronic schizophrenic, get treated and become
Undiagnosed,
well.
though,
Yeah,
wasn't she?
undiagnosed for the majority of her life. And so there was a lot going on, but I was very focused on being functional, being contributing how I could to society and the community and to my family. And so I think when my dad went and did that, it just brought everything undone because I just felt as though I'd worked so hard to make everything work as best it could despite growing up in very challenging circumstances. And then he went and did that, and it just ripped the carpet from underneath me, and it was a lot.
I mean, it is a lot. And I can really hear that you'd sort of built this kind of new house, this new home, wanting to do everything very differently, wanting to create space, but also holding yourself together despite the challenges and difficulties that you'd faced. And
Yes, I'd even
somehow,
moved across the country. I'd moved to the other side of the country to try to escape from it all. But as we know, that even when physically or metaphorically we run away from the things that have troubled us, they always catch up. Well, in my case, they did. I think what we resist persists. And until I dealt with it,
yeah.
it was always going to be looming.
Because in a way, he pulled down your kind of performative self, didn't he? And left you absolutely facing your most vulnerable, raw self who is unprotected and under attack, which I don't know if this is right, but what I've understood is really how you felt as a child.
Yeah, and I think that as a child I felt unsafe some of the time and uncertain a lot of the time, and I learned to navigate life between three different homes really. At my mum's place, growing up with my grandparents, my maternal grandparents there, where my mum was, as you mentioned, undiagnosed schizophrenic and experiencing every symptom
So she
to,
was psychotic and saw danger and
yes,
death and
everywhere. That's
so
right.
you were brought up in that kind of heightened state of vigilance of, the dustbin man is coming to kill us, that type of
Yes,
anxiety, a
yeah,
threat.
it was very much. I think when the Russell Crowe movie A Beautiful Mind came out, I
Yeah.
somehow felt seen. I felt as though I was understood, and that my mum was to an extent as well, because that was my only reference point as a young person, and that wasn't until I was a teenager that that came out. So yeah, so I grew up in a household where not only was I conditioned to become very hypervigilant around people and every circumstance that I came across. My grandparents were so hypervigilant, and my mum's siblings were hypervigilant. And so it was just a learned behavior that I took on unconsciously and completely unaware of, these adaptations to my own personality that were playing out throughout my life. And to skip back to the different households, so I was at my mum's place with my grandparents. I was at my dad's place where I grew up at my dad's backpackers, which was the biggest backpackers in the Southern Hemisphere. So I had 100 people sleeping over every night from every country around the world, every walk of life. We had rock bands, we had swim teams, basketball teams, we had surfers, we had also the lowest underbelly of society coming through and staying. We had families, but mostly it was young people and people just out to party and have a good time. And it was so interesting for me because, in a way, it was like an Alice in Wonderland experience on some days, because I would have flamethrowers and jugglers and buskers
Like
and
living in a
musicians.
circus.
Yeah, it was like growing up in the circus, but I also had to learn or cultivate this understanding of the transience of life, that people would come and go in and out of my day every day, week in, week out. So I had this hypervigilance at my mum's place with my grandparents, this sort of carefree
Revolving
upbringing.
door,
Yes, revolving door of people.
unpredictable in a different way, totally
That's
unpredictable
right.
again.
That's right. So I was really learning about people and the human condition in many different ways without realizing it. And then the third house that I stayed in for much of my childhood was my auntie's place in Hong Kong. So my father was from Hong Kong, and I would go to Hong Kong with him, and he would go off and do all of his business deals. And has these sort of grandiose ideas of being a
It's so funny.
businessman, and he's really funny. And so he would go off to scheme and to, conquer the world with his empire. And he'd leave me with my beautiful auntie, who was actually the world's first Chinese air hostess in Hong Kong for BOAC, which is, of course, now British Airways. And in
British
those
Overseas
days,
Airline Corporation it was, yeah.
yes, yeah. And so, and she was an air hostess for BOAC before my time, but I would hear stories of the day, and I actually got to see the reverberations of that time in her life when I was growing up, because we would go to people's homes and we would go to all of the clubs in Hong Kong, and I was really
Wow.
exposed to this very opulent and beautifully rich lifestyle in Hong Kong, which was the opposite of the lifestyle that I was experiencing in Perth, in Australia.
That's such a rich tapestry, but tell me the sense that how when you look back and when you so you had you had the letter that was on the table for a few days and then you read it was Kwa versus Kwa, and overnight you went grey. And it felt like you had a breakdown, that at that point, everything you had built within yourself to kind of keep the threats at bay kind of collapse. Then you had to kind of face what the demons were, I guess. And do you want to tell us how you did that? Because many people, they wouldn't necessarily be sued by their parents, but they can have a very attacking relationship. So I think it's really helpful for them to hear someone like you talk about how you kind of manage that.
So my dad and I did have a very combative relationship on and off throughout our history together since I was born. And I think that that was, now that I've investigated it more, born of my father's deep need to survive and
And
want,
trauma.
yeah, the trauma, of course, the intergenerational trauma. So when I received the letter, I suppose subliminally I had two choices. I could either let this breakdown break me, um, because all of the construct that I'd built around me had actually crumbled and I was left very bare and very vulnerable, or I could really go inward and investigate why I'm feeling this way and what is it about my relationship with my father and what is it about him that makes him the sort of person who would want to sue me. So I kind of took that bigger picture view to try to unpack who he was. And what that did was took me back in time. It took me
Mm.
back to my great great grandfather and then my great grandfather. And I traced the family from the imperial compound in Beijing. They were silk traders. And I looked at the diaspora of the Kwa family. And then when my dad arrived, he was one of 32 brothers and sisters.
Which is, and it wasn't even sure of that number, right? Because sometimes
Yeah,
when girl sisters weren't
weren't counted.
counted.
That's right. So it could have been more. It
It's
wouldn't
just
have been less, but
unbelievable.
it could have been more.
From
And
different mothers, though, to be fair. It
from
wasn't one
three
poor
different
woman.
mothers. No, it wasn't one poor woman, but it was three wives at the same time. And each of those wives were teenage child brides.
Oh my
And
goodness.
essentially, this was only two generations ago for me. So this is my grandfather and my grandmother's plural on my dad's side. So it's not that long ago, really.
No.
It feels like it's ancient China, but it's actually not ancient China. It's quite recent. So my dad was one of 32 brothers and sisters. So for a start, imagine growing up in a household of so many siblings and having to navigate your way as the youngest boy of all of these siblings. So he was certainly not the top of the
Seen
pecking order
and
by
not
any
cosseted
means.
and not. He was
No,
no
he
one's little
was
prince, was he?
that's right. He was raised essentially by the maids and the servants in the household. And so that was, the first thing that no, I discovered. I actually already knew that he had so many different siblings, but what I did was I really investigated it and really tried to understand what it must have been like growing up in Hong Kong at that time in such a big family with the different wives living on different floors in their house on Wuhu Street. And then I really wanted to understand, well, what was the time, what was the era that he grew up in? Well, of course, it was during the Second World War. And he was about 7 years old when the Japanese invaded Hong Kong, which was, of course, British occupied Hong Kong. And so they all, already had the British occupiers that they had adapted their culture to, and everybody was getting along very well. And then in come the Japanese, who were, much more hostile in their takeover. And my
And very
dad was only
brutal.
7. Yeah, that's right. So for him to live through that, and the Japanese occupation lasted for 3 years and 8 months, and feedback I get from a lot of people from around the world is, oh my goodness, I did not even know about the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong. It is
Because it's
something
always
that,
Singapore that's thought of, not Hong
yes,
Kong.
yeah. And so they had their own experience that really hasn't been broadly written about. Even the South
Gosh.
China Morning Post wrote an article on my book saying this is one of the few books that has actually mentioned it. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. And actually it's not surprising because when I went to research it, there wasn't a lot that I could find. So I really had to dig quite deep to figure out what life must have been like. And also I asked my dad once we
I
were
mean,
speaking
what's
again.
interesting is that one of the most difficult things about trauma is that it never wants to be voiced. It always wants to be suppressed. And and that can be true of countries as well as people and families. So in some ways, and I don't know if the Singaporeans have actually, in the way that more and more, like in Germany now, they are facing the trauma of the Second World War and doing a lot of reparation and a lot of restorative kind of psychological work. In Southeast Asia, that hasn't happened at all, has it, as far as I
No,
know?
it hasn't. And I think that that's very entrenched culturally, this idea that we just, it's not quite the stiff upper lip, but I guess it's the equivalent of it in that we just dust ourselves off and we keep going because this is just a blip in history. You know, the Chinese, for example, and obviously, you know, the Chinese population has populated Southeast Asia in different ways, but the Chinese, for example, see any war or any time frame as just a dot
A
in
dot.
history. It's really, it's nothing. And that's why I think, from the little that I know, that's why I think they shrug so much off because it's okay, let's just move on. And after the
Is that
Japanese,
Confucius as well, or is that from religion as well, or is it just cultural?
well, I think in a religious way, the idea, you know, in Buddhism of impermanence and equanimity and those sorts of things. I think that's in a slightly different lane to this idea of
Mm.
world domination, and let's just shrug it off because we've got other fish to fry. Uh,
Just
so,
keep going. The thing
yeah,
is just to keep going,
yes, keep going.
survive.
To win, to survive is different to keep going because, in the grand scheme of the universe, it doesn't matter. So, yeah, which is very interesting to unpack both those things because maybe they end up in the same place. Although I feel like one school of thought comes from love and the other school of thought sort of emanates from fear.
Yeah, and fight. And so, what is really fascinating is epigenetics. That what can get passed down behaviorally from patterns, but also get passed down in the shaping of our genetic system,
Mm.
and the understanding of what doesn't get faced in one generation, where someone doesn't feel the pain gets passed down till the next generation until someone's prepared to feel the pain. And it
Yeah,
felt
you've
like
got to feel it to heal it.
you've got to feel it to heal it, which goes alongside what you resist persists. So, isn't it? It's those two, that you have to do the thing you most don't want to do, which is allow yourself to feel the pain or allow yourself to explore as you did. What did you learn? What supported you? What enabled you to come through? Because you look like you've come through in one piece.
I have. Some people say to me, "How did you turn out so normal after all of that?" Uh, I guess resilience is a word that comes to mind. That, you know, there are so many ways to talk about resilience or how that unfolds, you know, in our lives. But another quip that I love is our issues are in our tissues. So we've talked about what you resist, persist. You've got to feel it to heal it. Our issues are in our tissues is one that, in terms of your question, and what I turn to is one that I had to recognize that if I don't break this cycle and if I don't confront my past and if I don't really do the inner work to try to heal these behaviors that I've not only inherited but I've cultivated myself because of self-protectionism, if I don't do that, those issues are going to sit in my tissues and make me even sicker than I already feel because I was
Or I
making
give them
myself
to my
sick.
4 kids.
That's right. So I think the greatest gift that we can give our children, or I felt that the greatest gift I could give my children, was not to pass down my trauma to them or the behaviors that my trauma actually cultivated in me. So that was really, I got really present with it. And I think that what
Must
helped
have been so
me,
painful.
it was, and there was a lot of crying and there was a lot of um, just pushing through that pain and those intrusive thoughts and those repetitive intrusive thoughts and the cycles of um, just being down on myself when I was feeling that I wasn't making any headway because nothing seemed to be changing in the relationship with my father or even in my relationship with myself. But I was full of hope. And I think that throughout my life, that's been something that I can be grateful for, is that I have been resilient, and probably because of growing up in the backpackers and growing up with my auntie in Hong Kong and growing up with my mum and having to be hyper vigilant. Because I've come through all of that, and because I have had people, you know how they say you just need one person who believes in you in your
Yeah.
life. And I
One
had
good
more than
person.
one. Yeah, one good person. You know, I had my auntie, I had, you know, my grandparents, my dad, even in his funny roundabout way, he believed in me. I had my mum, you know, even with her illness, she believed in me. So I did have a cheer team, a cheer squad, but it was just a bit of a dysfunctional one.
Yeah.
And so I was lucky in that way. And then in terms of dealing with my father and my relationship with him and the court situation, I started writing. So I really think that journaling is a huge therapy. So I
Huge.
started writing, and that's how the book came about. And then at the same time, I decided I should go to therapy. And in all my years, I had never, and you will, you know, from reading my story and anybody
Mm.
who dips into it, you'll see that there were a whole lot of traumatic events that occurred throughout my childhood and my teenage years. And then I just decided to put that behind me, put that in a shoebox, put it on the shelf, and then start my media career. And then, you know, went on to success being a newsreader and have had a great career that I'm so grateful for. But I didn't confront the past, and I had never seen a therapist. And so finally I decided, and that's what it took. It took my dad to sue me for me to realize I needed to see a therapist and I needed support, mental health support. And so I started seeing a psychologist, and she was an enormous help. But then the piece of the
How did she
puzzle,
help?
well, she helped just by helping to validate my childhood, I suppose, because I hadn't, you know, I'd spoken about various things to friends and to my partner, but I'd never been able to sort of sit and hyperanalyze my responses and why trauma was trauma. And now I understand that trauma isn't what happens. Trauma is when you don't feel heard or supported or consoled around what happens. So I can see now that the stories that I created around what happened was because I didn't have anybody, I didn't have an adult who was supporting me, and helping me process those events. And as a result, I didn't process them. They happened. I created stories around them. Those stories stayed with me for most of my life until I went to therapy and realized, oh, I've just created these stories about around these incidents. So that was months and months, if not years, of therapy. And one thing that my therapist said to me, which was the most helpful thing in all of our sessions, and I'm sure that all of the sessions were instrumental and important in building the building blocks to get to this point where this thing that I'm about to tell you was so helpful. I'd gone into every session always with something about my dad that was going on, always with something about my mum and, you know, memories of the past. And then specifically about my dad, my therapist said, Mimi, if your father was hanging onto one end of a rope and you were hanging onto the other and you're dangling off the cliff and he's shaking the rope, what do you do? And I said, well, I climb up the rope. And she said, no, you can't. He's just shaking it too vehemently. I said, well, I negotiate with him. No, you can't do that, Mimi, because he's not listening. And I said, you know, I fold the rope and I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And I
Kept
had
on
every,
finding a solution.
kept on going. And then, of course, and you know, Julia, what she must have said. She said, Mimi, just let
Let
go,
go.
let go. And I just, the epiphany was incredible. I let go and I could feel myself
Release.
falling, falling through the air,
Ooh.
and I was free. It was amazing. And that just shifted and reframed my entire relationship with my father going forward. Obviously, as I mentioned, all of the work leading up to that was really important to get me to that point where I could let go. And it really profoundly changed the way I related to him from then on.
Can I pause there and
Mm,
understand for our listeners what let go means in psychological terms? I mean, what I understand from it is that while you're still trying to wrestle and change him by negotiation or anger or, you know, doing more psychological gymnastics to try and get the dad you want, it keeps you in his thrall in a way, and it keeps you a child. And when you release yourself from that, you kind of surrender, I think, to a great extent and let him be him, you know, who is certainly eccentric, but extremely grandiose, and, and fascinating and funny and talented in lots of ways, isn't he? But when you surrender to who he is rather than trying to change him, you get yourself back. You get more of yourself. You can be yourself. Is that what you mean?
Absolutely. I let go of trying to change him, and I let go of trying to make what was any different to what it was. And that was, for me, such a simple and profound thing that I can apply to all sorts of things in life now. And I think taking my healing and therapy one step further, I think the final piece of the puzzle with me was to actually find a deeper spirituality. So I've always felt that I was not necessarily a religious person, but a spiritual person,
Mm.
and believed or felt that there was something greater than us that, moves through us, and that we have a greater purpose on earth than just to live and die in this life. And once I started to delve into that more deeply, then I discovered, different tenets of Buddhism that really aligned themselves with the psychological counseling that I'd been having with my therapist. And I just thought, wow. And then I sort of found these practitioners or leaders in the field like Tara Brach and Jack Cornfield, who are clinical psychologists, and they are also teaching Buddhist practices around meditation and mindfulness. And this idea of letting go and accepting what is really present in a practice that I've learnt called RAIN, which you have probably heard of. And
Mm.
that is, to recognize what it is that you're experiencing and feeling. And that could be, a physical sensation like a tightening of the chest or a constriction of the throat or the heart beating faster, or something physical, or it could be the emotion that you're feeling, which is fear. And a lot of the time, when I describe to myself an emotion that I'm feeling, it actually, when you dig down, it's actually a fear based emotion, because I'm afraid that I'm going to be rejected, or I'm afraid that I'm not going to succeed. And
Which will lead to rejection. That's why
that's
it
right,
matters.
exactly.
Yeah.
So it actually, all roads lead to Rome in a way. And so then recognizing what it is the R in RAIN. And then the A is to allow. And the allow is really the letting go. So the allow is just to accept and
Let it
allow
be.
what is. It just let
Mm.
it be and sit with it. And then the I in RAIN is to investigate. And so then I go a little bit deeper into the feeling and the emotion, and setting the thoughts aside. I just investigate, well, why am I feeling this? And often it's because my inner child, or in all practicality, the actual child Mimi, experienced something that was very difficult that led to this feeling or this thought now.
Mm.
And then the N in RAIN is nurture. And so that is
Nice.
actually an opportunity that I take to be able to give my inner child a hug, or put my hand on my
Yeah.
heart and say, forgiven, forgiven, or I love you. And it just really helps. And the little
Yeah.
things like that, it's so profoundly helpful just on a daily basis.
So profoundly helpful. And it's very different from how you survived before, when you were kind of marching to succeed, and you did it really well because you learned so from such a young age how to adapt to fit with other people's expectations and how to build a relationship, in order to survive. You learned that in your father's home. I'm sure with Teresa, where she took you all to these different places, and with your mum. But it came from a place of fear, really, of a frightened child. And what you're talking about now is that your internal self feels awake and alive in you, so that you know what's going on, so you can respond to what's going on rather than kind of keeping it shut down.
Yes, absolutely. I'm being responsive now rather than reactive.
Yes, that's a
and
lovely
and
word.
I feel so aligned with life now. My predisposition has always been to be present and to be connected, but now I feel such alignment with life that I can be in that state of presence and connection with the humans around me so much more often I was before. Because before, when I was racing and trying to succeed and
Pushing.
pushing myself, my mind was always jumping ahead and thinking
ahead.
about the
Mm.
next thing and not in the present moment. And it's quite amazing how just cultivating that awareness and that self conscious intention to be present, it's amazing how that can just shift your life from being this, I don't know, really busy, almost vacuous in some ways experience to this really deeply enriched, beautiful existence. And I really, I mean, I know that it sounds very extreme to go from this high flying media career. You know, I was in helicopters every day and I was chasing celebrities like Russell Crowe and interviewing Serena Williams and having this amazing life, which I did enjoy and I was very present, you know, some of the time. But because I was striving and pushing, I really didn't stop to smell the roses. I didn't enjoy it as much as
Couldn't
I
take it all
could
in.
have. I couldn't take it all in. And now I get as much of a thrill just sitting and looking at the tree outside my window as I did sitting with a major celebrity. And I think it just speaks to the types of, you know, the dopamine and the chemicals that we actually have access to
Serotonin.
every day.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
serotonin in our bodies and in our brains. We are our own pharmacy.
We are our own pharmacy. And actually, I can feel it, although you and I have never met, and you're literally the other side of the world in a completely different time zone. I can feel your presence. I can feel you in connection with me. And I can feel you going at your internal pace, like you're not delivering a story, you're being your story, and you're kind of aware of it as you're saying it. And that just feels so much deeper and kind of resonates in my body. It's very calming to be with. Like I'm not having to work very hard. I'm just here.
I'm
I'm
pleased.
here.
Yeah, and so am I. And I think with these sorts of conversations, we get the most out of them when we're just here and we're just present and listening and just following the
Being.
intuition.
Because the other thing I was really interested in is how we're influenced by our culture. And you talk about your dad as the dragon and you as the tiger. And I'd love you to kind of explain that.
Well, I love the metaphors of the dragon and the tiger in Chinese mythology, and they are such celestial beasts, and they just, you know, the imagery that you conjure when you think of the dragon and tiger, there's something romantic, there's something
Exotic.
fierce, there's something exotic, and I am actually born in the year of the tiger. So I've always really followed my Chinese horoscope and you know I've ascribed to that zodiac belief system. And so it felt very natural to use that as a metaphor for me in the book. Now, I have to admit that my dad wasn't born in the year of the dragon. However, year of the pig didn't have the same ring to it. So,
Your dad.
so I took poetic license and I made him a dragon. I hope that you'll forgive me.
No, he'd have been unhappy being a pig, wouldn't he? He really wouldn't.
He would have, and I think the
Direct
cover.
line to the court of the Chinese emperor, he would not be happy being a pig.
That's right. And also, I think the cover of the book wouldn't have had the same sort of shine with a dragon
No.
and a pig on the front.
So tell us more about the tiger and the dragon.
Yeah, so I mean, really, it's a metaphor that I use throughout the book to really illustrate this combative relationship that my father and I have. And because the dragon is, you know, in Chinese um, astrology, the dragons don't fly. That's just sort of a mythical Western belief. I did kind of conjure this idea of this, you know, dragon flying overhead and me, the tiger, hiding under the shrubs and running through the forest. And it really,
Opened your
it
imagination,
did
which was
open my
curative.
imagination, and it was curative, but it just evoked this kind of this race, and it was this race to survive, I think, between these two beasts that weren't really stopping. And both of us, you know, we weren't really seeing sense. We were just running and fighting and surviving. And I think that, you know, I feel my heart even beating faster
Yeah.
thinking about that running through the
Yeah.
forest. And I think that once we do well, I don't want to spoil the ending for you, but my father and I do get along very well now. I have to
But you
say.
did the work. I'm not sure he did that much work, did he?
He didn't, but it's amazing how when I opened to that full, wholehearted acceptance of him. Like literally, I sat with him and held his hands and looked into his eyes and said, Dad, I love you. You know, I am so sorry for everything that you've been through. And I understand why you did this. And I didn't even go so far as to say, I forgive you, because he would have had no concept of that, because he actually says to me, well, I forgive you, Mimi. So I said to him, I just said, Dad, I'm so grateful to you. And I'm so great. And I've even said to him, not in that sitting, but I've had lots of sittings with him since. And I've even said to him, Dad, I am so grateful that you sued me in the Supreme Court, because if that hadn't happened, I would never have healed from all of my own demons and my own trauma. And I know that when I say that to my dad, there's this glimmer of recognition. There's this the real him that shines through in his eyes just for a moment. And then he snaps back into his ego and behaves as though he doesn't really know what I'm talking about. But
But
when I
there's
have
a
these, there's
little
something,
moment that
there's a moment where it's my soul connecting with his, and it's beautiful. And it's just father, daughter, nobody's watching. It's just us. We don't have to put on a show for anybody. He doesn't have to pretend that he's somebody else, which he spends, most of
his
his life
entire life
doing.
doing. Yeah.
And I've spent a fair share of my life doing that too in different ways. And so it has been profound and beautiful to have those moments with him, even if for him it's just a flicker. For me, it means so much that he sits and there's something or someone in him that needs to hear this and wants to hear it, because he doesn't interrupt me when I'm saying these things. He's either just so befuddled by it, or he's just profoundly moved, to to a degree. Either way, I love it. I feel healed. So
And I mean, we're not going to tell the story of the reason why he sued you or what the outcome was. But I think what's really incredibly powerful is hearing how your childhood conditioning, and particularly as a girl, as a Chinese girl. I mean, I don't think, I think we know a lot about conditioning in the Western world. I don't think we've really become aware of the conditioning of Chinese girls. I mean, I'd love you to say something about that. But the
the
big thing is when you untangle or unhook yourself from pleasing him or fighting him or performing him and release yourself to be you, you can have those moments of connection, whether he does or not. And it kind of resolves the exhaustion of the wheel that you're on. And so that feels incredibly powerful and healing. And that also there is something, even I knew it with my mum when I would say things and I would see her just take a little moment and she'd take it in. She'd never acknowledge it. But there is something that you can feel in your soul and your heart that you made that deeper connection.
and that in itself makes it all worth it. And so I will tell you the story about when my dad read the book. So
Yes.
it's just a quick story, but it just gives that little bit more insight into him. So the publisher HarperCollins initially was going to pull the book because they thought that my dad would sue the publishing house, and they said we've never had a memoir, a non-fiction book written where the protagonist is a vexatious litigant. So we
Because he
don't think
sues
it's a good.
everyone, your
He
dad. That's
sues
what he
everyone.
does.
That's right. You look at him sideways, he sues you. So he even sued the neighbour for a boulder was 2 centimetres over the driveway,
My
on
God,
our
so wants
property,
a
and he
fight.
sued them. He wants a fight, exactly. So that's in his nature, as you're well gathering. So they were going to pull the book. They decided not to, um, because they said that if he was going to sue, they wanted me to take things out of the book, then put them back in, because they decided if he was going to sue the publisher, he was going to do it anyway, regardless of what was in the book. We were in lockdown here in Melbourne. Melbourne was the most lockdown city
God,
in the world, claim to
gosh,
fame over here. And
gosh.
when the book came out during the pandemic, during the Melbourne lockdown, I was homeschooling 4 children, and well, I wasn't homeschooling them, but I was overseeing their homeschooling. And everybody was home. You know, we were working from home, they were studying from home, and
It's
I forgot that
intense.
it was intense. And I forgot that my book was coming out anywhere other than in my suburb. Like I really had lost all concept of what was going on.
Your
So
boundaries got so close, they were literally around
that's
your
right.
garden fence.
Around
Yeah.
my garden fence, that's right, or within 5 kilometres. That was how far we were allowed to go. And so when the book came out, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is the ABC here in Australia, they very kindly did a television commercial about my book. And it was this beautiful animation of the tiger and the dragon and this Chinese sort of dong, dong, dong music and describing
Lovely.
the book. And I thought, oh, how wonderful. And then I realised that it was shown all over Australia, like not just within 5 kilometres of my house. And I got a call from my dad, and my dad said, Mr. Wong down the road says I'm on television. And I was like, oh
Oh
no,
my
he
God.
knows. And I hadn't actually told him that I'd written a book.
You hadn't told him.
I hadn't told him because I just know
An
his
analyst
nature.
would have something to say about that. It's like, you
Yeah.
don't forget that, do you? I mean,
No, I didn't forget. I just didn't tell him because I just thought I'll deal with it when I deal with it. I thought I'll deal with it when I see him. You know, I love him and I'll deal with it then. So, and I said, "Oh, well, look, my friends at the ABC, because of course I've read the news at the ABC for 20 years. So I just kind of brushed it. Oh, my friends at the ABC are probably just doing a little TV commercial about the book. It's probably nothing." You know, I said, "When lockdown finishes and when the borders open, I'll come and sit with you, Dad, and I'll read through it with you, and it will all be lovely, and we can talk about the past and how wonderful." And I said, "So whatever you do," and this is a red flag to a bull, "don't go out and buy the book." so of course, so of course
he
the
buys the
next,
book.
yeah. So the next day I get a text message from him, and he says, "I've gone to the local bookstore. I bought the book. It was 34.95, which is in Australian dollars, so don't panic."
Yeah.
And he said, "And it was very expensive, and it's a load of rubbish." And I sent him a message back, and I said, "Dad, how much have you read?" He said, "I'm up to page 17." And so anyway, the next 2 weeks I was on tenterhooks. I was starting, my anxiety was starting to come back. I was thinking all of this therapy and all of this work that I've done, it's all being undone again because I'm panicking because my dad's got hold of the book. And every couple of
The
days, my
court
dad,
case is finished by then,
yeah,
isn't it?
the court case is finished by then, but then I could see
Another
another
one.
one looming. So he was messaging me every couple of days, criticizing me, not really identifying anything in the book. So I wasn't sure whether he was actually reading it or not. And I mean, how could you resist, though, a whole book about you?
Yeah. Yeah.
And 2 weeks later, he said, he messaged me. I was too scared to pick up the phone to him. That's how anxious I was.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he messaged me and he said, "I've finished the book. It's a load of rubbish. It's very Harry Potter's, plural. But I just want to say one thing. I think our ancestors would be proud."
Wow.
Yeah. And of course, I was just a flood of tears reading this message. I also
Yeah.
screenshot it and sent it to the HarperCollins lawyers. And
Yes.
because I was like, phew, he's okay about it. That was another amazing insight into him, that he obviously reframed it in his mind as a good thing, which I think it is a good thing because it's
It
helped
is.
our healing as a family, but I didn't
Yeah.
think that he would be able to see it like that.
But it's his ancestors he could connect to, right?
Yes, he didn't say he was proud.
No.
He said, "I think our
Our ancestors.
ancestors would be proud." So that was his way of saying that he was proud. And coming back to the filial daughter, the obligation thing and the conditioning of Chinese girls, Chinese women.
To be a bay and to
Yes,
kowtow
that
and
that's right. And I mean that was my upbringing, and yet I was and also coming back to the tiger metaphor. I was meant to behave like a mouse, but I felt like a tiger inside.
yes. I love the tiger. And are you more of a tiger than your brothers?
I think I am. One of my brothers is Year of the Horse, and one of my brothers is Year of the Dragon, actually. So there is a dragon in the immediate family, which is lovely. And they are 15 years younger than me, thereabouts, and
God,
they just laugh. When I say laugh, I mean I think that they're a bit bemused by the fact that I've written a book about it to deal with my own trauma and the family trauma. I know that they are proud of me, and but I would stop short of saying they're grateful that I've written the book, because I think one of them, even 2 years later, is only halfway through it himself. Their wives have both read read the story, but I think that it's and when I did give them the book 2 years ago when it came out in Australia, I know that it's only just come out in the UK.
okay,
Um, when I gave them the book, I wrote them each a big long letter just saying, I understand if you never read it because there's a lot in there, and I know that you've experienced your own version of
trauma.
the choir trauma. And it's not for me to own their story or speak on their behalf. This is just my
Yours.
story, and it's almost a love story with my dad and with my mum as well. You know, we haven't talked about my mum. She's not the choir side, but she, as you mentioned before, she was undiagnosed chronic and acute schizophrenic. And I say chronic and acute schizophrenic because when she was diagnosed, that's what they actually wrote down. And I thought, oh gosh, she's not only a schizophrenic, she's chronic and acute.
And acute.
Yes. So how extreme can you get? You know, my poor mum living like that for 50
In
years.
terror in herself of her own
Yes,
demons. Yeah.
yes. Really, really shocking. And for most of my childhood, she would lock herself in her room. She was a hoarder. She managed to get herself through university, but when she received electric shock treatment, ECT, when she was 17, that
Gosh.
really broke her. She was wrongly diagnosed as being bipolar,
Bipolar.
and she was only 17, you know, and
Oh
she
my
was
God.
sent
Her
into
brain was
this
still developing. Oh
yeah, and she
God.
was sent into this institution. Her parents weren't allowed in. It was so archaic. And when she came out, she was a broken girl, and her parents vowed never to seek professional help again.
Help again. Well, of course, their
And
trust was
then
utterly broken. Yeah.
that's right. And then, even though obviously medicine progressed, science progressed, psychology
Yes.
progressed, the world kept moving, but my
Psychiatric treatment.
grandparents wouldn't, because
No.
they had been so badly
Betrayed.
damaged and
Yeah.
betrayed from that experience. And so, as a result, my mum wasn't treated until after my grandparents passed away. And then I took
Oh,
the baton for her care, and finally, and of course, I actually, with that inherited behavior from my grandparents, I actually tried to brush it under the carpet because I thought, oh well, that's what they did for all of my life. That's
that's what I've
now it's
learned to
my
do.
turn. Yep, that's what
Mm.
I'll need to do. But then I had one child and one on the way at that point, and my mum moved over from Perth, from the other side of Australia, to live with my husband and me, and my 1.5 children. And I just couldn't brush it under the carpet anymore.
No,
I
you were
just thought,
living with it.
I can't
Yeah.
relive my childhood, but with my
My
children.
children.
Yeah. And so then getting her psychiatric treatment was a whole other kettle of fish and
Story.
another story, but it was one with a happy ending. And my mum now lives with me and my husband and our 4 children here in this
Wow.
house that I'm broadcasting to you from. And
Amazing.
yeah, it is amazing and it's wonderful, and she's well,
And it's
and
managed. Yeah.
it's managed.
Oh, Mimi, what a story. There are so many stories within the stories. And I really recommend everyone reading your book because it is fascinating. What is the main message you want people to take from you, really? Your book is part of you, but you.
I love the idea that when you hand a book into the world, it's no longer yours, and that it's for the reader to take what they would like to take. But I will answer your question and say that I feel that the main message that is fed back to me by readers is one of deep forgiveness. So,
Yeah.
forgiveness of others and forgiveness of self. And
Yes.
so, if that is what somebody takes from it, then that makes me so happy. And if
And
somebody's just entertained, then I'm happy too.
yeah. And in the forgiveness is also compassion, isn't it? For sort of
Mm.
human frailty, the idea that however we're behaving, at some level, we're doing the best we can, given who we are and where we've come from and how we kind of manage ourselves.
Everyone is doing the best that they can. And I think that's what I came to recognize in writing my story and doing the deep healing work, is that both my father and my mother did the best that they knew how to do, given the circumstances, given their own conditioning, given their own upbringing, given their own ancestry that I
Yeah.
share with both of them. We are all doing the best that we can. We are all walking each other home. And it's such a beautiful thing when you can reframe life and just see that we're all suffering. You know, there is no sin, there is only suffering. And that, and little, sayings and expressions like that I just take with me as daily mantras through my day really help with every interaction.
That's such a lovely way to end. And I love actually that expression, we're all walking each other home. I think that's a really beautiful way to end. So thank you, Mimi.
Thank you, Julia.
Hello, Sophie and Emily. We're going to talk about Mimi Kwa, which, on listening to it again, actually, it was such a kind of vibrant, alive conversation. And I just wondered what your thoughts were. There was so much in it, isn't there, about culture and trauma and transgenerational trauma and families.
Yes, I mean, also she's got a lovely voice to listen to. I feel like I'd quite like her to do a sort of sleep sort of story that I could kind of fall asleep to. Her voice is very sort of melodic.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
But also, I was just desperate to know, why did she get sued? How did you get through the whole conversation without naming it? And I didn't know whether she sort of had asked you not to name it, but I did Google it.
Did you?
But I'm going to read the book to you.
I'm still left hanging.
No, I was just really in suspense. Am I allowed to say, or should I make people go either Google it themselves or?
I think so.
So, her dad sues her over the estate of her lovely Aunt Therese in is it Hong Kong?
Yeah, Hong Kong.
In Hong Kong. But I don't know the outcome, and obviously I am excited.
Or the process.
Or the process, or what happened in the end, exactly. So I'm excited to read the book.
We discussed the outcome in the pod, didn't we?
You discussed the outcome of their relationship.
Yes.
Not of the court case.
No. Okay.
Yes,
let's leave that. Let's leave that.
Yes, I didn't Google that. So I couldn't tell you anyway. But you could, Mum, presumably, because you read the book.
Yes, I did read the book. I tell you the thing, as a member of a big family, my biological family, the thing that I think I would have found impossible was to go for the love and the exploration and not the fight. It takes such incredible, I don't even know, like digging deeper than I would ever have in me, not to just be so upset and so furious to get into fight or flight and just go for it. I mean, what do you think that is that enabled her to kind of explore and find out more, so then she came with compassion?
Well, I would love to have heard that from her. I wonder if her book goes into that.
It does,
because it's like we got the outcome that she has forgiven him. You know, she said that people said the theme of the book, the often feedback she got was that it was about forgiveness. And even when she's telling the story, the very funny and sweet story of him reading the book,
and saying
also obviously still very clearly behaves in a really difficult and provocative way, right? Yeah. It's rubbish, lots of messages, but her tone of voice doesn't reflect that. She doesn't go, well, you know, he did say it was rubbish. It was like she was really, somehow she's got to a place, hasn't she, where she has fully accepted who he is and decided to meet him there. And somehow it sounds like, and I don't know, maybe she says more in the book, Mum, that you can say, but she seems to no longer take it as a personal attack. You know, like when you tell that story with your mum. Yeah, and that you say, you know, with your mum, when you sort of, you would get her to say she loves you, and you put her arms around your neck and, I love you, Mum. That somehow you got to a place with her where you didn't take it personally, that she didn't say that she loved you, but you felt that she did. that you then could lean towards her in a way that didn't hurt you.
It's true. That's true.
Yeah, I think obviously I don't know her process, and it's really an extraordinary example of just proper sort of radical acceptance, really. Like
It was letting go of the rope, though, is what she explained, wasn't it? Like,
it's
stop
letting-
tussling.
stop trying to make him somebody he's never going to be.
Yeah.
And then you have a choice. Like, you can either just accept him as he is and be with him in that and love him as he is, or her other option was to move away, right? To say, like, I don't need this in my life. It's not bringing me anything. I can't, and it's possibly damaging me. And for some people, that might be the thing they need to do too. But I think to make that decision, there's something about this sort of acceptance, like Soph said, that it's not about approval. It's not about sort of saying, like, this is what I would want or winning. It's about saying, like, I can't change it. I can't even necessarily change how I feel about it, but I can just accept it and try not to fight it. And paradoxically, when you do that, it does change how you feel about it.
Yes, and I think this question of, I think many people are podcasts, it's sort of come up in different versions of our agonities. It's like, how do I keep having a relationship with a parent or a partner or someone in my life who is very challenging in some way? Or do I stop having a relationship with them? And there's obviously no right answer. But I think one of the things that is interesting about that dilemma is it also costs energy to estrange yourself from someone.
Right.
It's very high cost, not just the event of choosing it and the immediate repercussions, but to stay alienated from a member of your family is also emotional labor. So there's sort of a form of emotional labor, whatever you do, and it's a question of really making that decision for yourself of which is the safer, better, healthier version of that for you. But all require work. It's not like cutting off is this like freedom ticket.
No. Or you can cut off and not think about it, but alongside that goes with a lot of other things that you have to cut off. It's like you can't just take a bit out and not expect other bits to go with it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Because on the bandwidth of what we feel, if you shut one thing, if you have
Right.
pain one end and you shut one thing, you incrementally block your capacity for the joyous, love, happy things.
Yes.
What else came up for you?
So one thing that came up for me, and it has come up for me in my work in various forms too, was actually not to do with her dad, but to do with her mum and having a schizophrenic parent or having a parent with a mental illness, particularly if you have a parent with a personality disorder. Then you really grow up with the experience that emotions are very, very frightening, that emotions just cause damage, they just cause harm, they're not really tolerable. And I think that has a really profound impact on children, but also children as they grow up and become adults. And it made me think of the work of Alfred Bion, who talks a lot about the role of a parent as like the container, like a container of feelings, and not just containing, but also sort of digesting them and then sort of delivering them back to the child in a way that the child is then able to kind of digest themselves. Yeah, exactly. And without that container, and I think about Bion a lot in my work as a therapist, but and also from a sort of, he writes a lot about the sort of the role of the mum with the baby as sort of containing. And I think if you don't have that experience of somebody who is able to contain your emotions and their own emotions and make them bearable, make them safe, make them digestible, emotions are totally terrifying and overwhelming. And you have to work out you still have them. It doesn't mean that you then don't have emotions or other people around you don't have emotions. So then you have to sort of find all these other ways to manage emotions. And it sounds like Mimi was really adaptive in the way she developed managing emotions by making everything very orderly and controlled and tidy. And that was very safe making until this sort of experience came and kind of blew up her life. But I do think it is very hard to do when you haven't had that experience of somebody managing emotions and all you've seen is that the sort of consequences of feelings are never good. There's not a repair, there's not an end, there's just chaos.
And what I'm thinking in response to that, is that often in families, particularly families with from different generations, that it's always don't feel, like shut up or don't upset me or behave yourself, or there's lots of ways of saying that we don't recognize is I find your feelings unbearable within myself. It's
Yes,
like
or
behave.
yes, and you don't even need to say it. Your reaction to somebody feeling can be so explosive or frightening that you just stop expressing your feeling, or you try to become a peacekeeper where you make yourself really, really small so that you don't provoke the people around you. And that's how you adapt. So, I mean, I think there's lots of different ways of adapting, aren't there?
And that kind of links to her intergenerational piece, doesn't it? Of sort of how she made sense of how she came to be in the history of her time. And
Our issues
there's,
are in our tissues. I have never heard that
I
before.
love
she has some
that.
great she
Yeah.
has some great lines. And I really, from a learning point of view, I did sort of open up like an awareness of, gosh, that I know very little really. When she was talking about her grandparents, her dad being one of 32 and her grandfather having three wives, and I wouldn't have known in China at that time that was how things often or could be were. I have no context for that. I don't even know how common that is for their time. But and it made me think about our podcast. There's a real upside to us being the three of us in our relationship as sisters, mother, family, and as therapists is very tight and connected. But on the other hand, culturally, in terms of the perspectives we bring, we're very narrow because
Yes.
because
We
we're
literally have
all
the same
white,
background.
we're all privileged, we literally grew up in the same family, So I don't know. There was something like, oh yeah, there's this whole other
World.
scope of perspectives, and she had such a rich one. Like it wasn't just China; it was Hong Kong, and Australia, and
And I love that South Asian perspective about tigers and dragons and the way that you could really understand yourself from a creative, imaginative perspective. And that she didn't want him to be a pig because he really wouldn't have been happy being a pig.
I think I might be a pig. I remember looking it up.
Oh, were
I
you?
think my
Year of the
husband's a
pig.
pig.
Oh, is he 83? He's the same as me. I mean, I think pigs. I'm sure there's lots of good qualities. It just doesn't. I'm a pig and a Cancer, and like neither of them sound that great.
I don't know what I am. I mean, I know my star sign. I don't know what you are.
I liked also when she was talking about moving across the country, and there's this sort of in AA speak they talk about doing a geographical, that and then wherever you go, oh, there you are,
Your
there you
baggage.
are, everything comes. I mean, I do actually think space can be helpful. I really do think it can be helpful.
It's helpful
But
for you with us.
yeah, although we sort of live quite close now, but yeah, it was
No,
definitely helpful in the
before.
past. Um,
You went to Australia, I remember.
and yeah, as far as I could go.
Yes.
And at the same time, the reality is that wherever you go, there you are.
So you can't really run away from what's inside you. Well, in fact, you can't run away from what's inside you. So the thing I was thinking with you was you've done quite a lot about restorative justice and forgiveness of others, and it includes the forgiveness of self. And I wondered if any of that came up for you listening, or that now I ask you.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I've done a lot in restorative justice, but certainly when I worked in prisons, the concept of forgiveness was not one that's very present in prison.
No.
Not present in prison, not present in probation. I wish it was. I wish it was. There is that lovely charity, the Forgiveness Project, and I really, if listeners are in their own kind of processing or journey around forgiveness, I really recommend it. It's got lots of different stories and they do lovely events. I do remember going along to one of their events where they had different people stand up. They had someone who had committed murder and gone to prison. They had someone whose sibling was killed by Rosemary West. And they had someone who was in the Serbian conflict and had been imprisoned and sort of tortured essentially by his own community, the people who had been around him that he'd grown up with. And they all sort of talked about their own process, and one of which, the Serbian man, said he couldn't. He tried in lots of, he's just like and that was interesting too, right? That there was a kind of point where he had to go, it's just right now it's not possible for me to forgive. But the energy, I think what they all spoke about was the sort of cost to themselves in not forgiving, more than the preoccupation with forgiving the other.
Because I think there's the sort of subtlety of it, if you like, or the complexity of it, is that it can feel like you're submitting and accepting. And it isn't about submitting and accepting. I think it's about acknowledging and naming and still kind of expanding your heart, I guess, to allow the awfulness of what it was, but also to allow that you want to change your relationship with that so that you're not constantly suffering. Because in some ways, while you hate, it's
imprisoning, isn't it?
It's imprisoning, yeah.
I think also, and Mimi really spoke to this, didn't she? And I imagine she speaks to it more in her book. But that process of trying to understand the why and getting it tangled up with that then being an excuse. Like feeling like if you have to understand, if someone gives an explanation for why they did what they did, that's the same as saying that what they did was okay. And it's not. It doesn't make it okay. This comes up often when working with people with abuse, isn't it? It's understanding the context in which they behave, that they may have been abused or they may have had whatever traumas in their own life. I think what it can support is a recognition that it's not about you. I think one of the things you receive when you're treated in an abusive way is that there's something wrong with you. You were somehow elicited that response, or there was something wrong about you. And that sometimes what that understanding the context is not about submitting, like you say, and going, oh, she wasn't really their fault and somehow I have to stop being angry or rejecting. It's more about helping with the letting go of going, this was really nothing, wasn't really about me.
Well, and also helps to make sense of it, right? Like it gives you
and have a narrative,
a more of a macro
perspective.
Yeah.
And then again, to use Mimi's metaphor, let go of the rope, because while you're still tussling, you're trying to kind of do something. Whereas if you, I don't know if surrender is the right word, but in some way, forgiving is a kind of surrender. I'm not sure it is.
Be interesting to hear what this is.
Yes. It's sort of releasing.
Releasing is a better word. So thank you both, and particularly thank you to Mimi and for writing her wonderful book, which I recommend to all of you. And thank you all for listening. And if you want to share this, please do with anyone you think might get something from it. Do please rate and subscribe. And if it's brought up an Agony Auntie question, do DM me on Instagram. And until next time, thank you.